Well, thanks for coming this evening. I know it's a bit cold out, and you've already got a hat, you said, when you got off the plane. So I have a hat here, I've taken it off. In some ways I look a little bit like a clown in it, but never mind. So I'm really, really happy that we have another person coming to visit us who's published in the LU book series about international slavery. Your book came out in 2020, so it's Dr Hilary Mc Laughlin-Stonham, and I had to practice the last bit then because I wasn't sure, who's written From Slavery to Civil Rights on the Streetcars of New Orleans. And we just had a little chat because we haven't met before, and unfortunately I've written down some things, I'm going to read them out. It's such an interesting chat about the things that went on her CV. I'm tempted to talk about those. I'll only mention a couple in case they're top secret. So you are an associate lecturer, and you can correct me if I get anything wrong, at Coventry University, and you've got MAs from Glasgow and Bangor, and you did your PhD at Ulster University on this subject. And you've done work, you've published in many journals, I won't read them all out, and you've done work on the American influence on British race relations and sort of burgeoning projects. You also, for the University of Liverpool, and I did not know this, even though I went to the exhibit opening and gave a small talk about something else, is that some of you have visited us at the university at Abercrombie Square, and we've been trying to do the history and include all sorts of people in that, and so that EDI group got some funding together so that we can have a permanent exhibit at the university about the history of Abercrombie Square and various things. So it's open to the public, please do come in. It's 19 to 23, the doors are open. If anyone wants a little tour, I guess you won't be here, but I can also take people around. And so there's text, there's all sorts up on the walls, and then there's a lot of stuff you can scan to learn further information. So thanks for contributing to that project, which just opened, I think, 3 weeks ago. I guess I don't have much more to say apart from that you have worked in South Korea, I didn't know that, and for the National Trust. And I asked you which your favourite child was, and you wouldn't tell me. And she's got 2 cats, but she does have a favourite. But I'm not going to out you on that.
Thank you.
Instead, I'm going to let you tell us about this really amazing research you've done on New Orleans from slavery to civil rights. So if we can have a short applause.
Okay, good evening. I'm delighted to be asked to speak this evening. We always want to talk about your research, so it's always good to get asked. So from slavery to civil rights on the streetcars of New Orleans, it's a huge topic. And so this evening I'm just going to look at some of the motivation behind this research and then highlight some of the main themes and findings from the research. And when I was putting this together, I was trying to think, if I was sitting where you were, what would I like to see in a PowerPoint or a talk on a book? So what I've done is I've tried to use images from New Orleans specifically, and a few other ones from Louisiana. I think there's one from outside Louisiana. So that I can try and bring the people that this research is about and the events to life for you, so that it's not just words on a page. Because when I was doing this research, it was something that I became very involved in, and it was the people that lived through these events. So I chose to look at one area of segregation that I could follow the social and legal restrictions through the slavery era in New Orleans to the civil rights period, and examine how race relations evolved in the form of not just legal separation of the races, but also the social etiquette that came alongside the legal restrictions. So the de jure, the legal aspects of segregation and the separation of the races, and the de facto, how it was in fact in society. And this book is laid out in that way that reflects that. So the law and reality. So each chapter addresses the making of transport law and examines transport court cases, the de jure segregation. Each chapter also examines newspapers, reports, eyewitness accounts, personal papers and recollections. And this is the de facto segregation. And the findings indicate that segregation on transport, despite legislation that was quite rigid, was elastic and influenced by events outside the streetcar carriages. The streetcars have been described as theatres for society. And so events outside the streetcars, whatever was happening, be it World War I, the Depression, influenced events inside the streetcars and how people behaved. Themes I'm going to look at today are Jim Crow segregation laws, the significance of transport and the significance of transport in Louisiana, significance of race, class and transport in New Orleans society, resistance and compliance on transport in the 20th century. Because one thing about segregation is as soon as we have segregation, we have protest against it. It was never an accepted law in society. There was always a push against segregation. And then we'll look at 20th century integration. So what was segregation? Jim Crow was a character, this character here, developed by Tim Rice, who was a musician and performer who performed in blackface in the 1830s. He toured around Europe and in America. The Jim Crow character he invented became a symbol of the black intruder in white society. And so the laws to prevent the black intruder into white society became known as Jim Crow laws. They were oppressive race laws that acted as guidelines for race relations in the United States of America, primarily between 1890 and 1965. They were enforced in most public places: restaurants, public toilets, drinking fountains, parks, schools, swimming pools, and most public places. This is the Confederate in green, United States of America. As many as 35 states recognized Jim Crow legislation, but the laws were more predominant in the 11 former Confederate southern states, where there was a history of slavery and a much larger black population. Laws against the black population were not a new phenomenon. Slavery, legalized and regulated for centuries, only detrimentally affected the slaves, who were, by definition, black. But free blacks also existed in this environment, often having their own wealth and influence, always, however, under the shadow and caprices of white lawmakers in society. Jim Crow laws differed across the United States and indeed across the Confederate states, the southern states, as did the experience of black and whites of those laws within those states. Virginia, for example, had 25 laws concerning black people, some of which even forbade them from entering the public library. Texas, on the other hand, had 27 Jim Crow laws, allowing black citizens to use the library, but in which they had to be segregated. Likewise, many of the states passed similar laws regarding marriages between blacks and whites, but the punishment for infringing these laws differed greatly. In some states, it could be up to 7 years hard labor. In other states, it was a $250 fine and 2 years in prison. Significance of transport. Transport was an important focus of the civil rights movement. It was the freedom rides of the 1960s that shared the meaning of segregation with the world. Burning buses, attacks on passengers in waiting rooms symbolized the inequality of the separate but equal mandate. It became a cause célèbre for blacks and liberal whites, and one which created the stereotype of the white southerner as a violent and angry criminal. Now, transport in Louisiana. Louisiana is a state in the deep south. It was traditionally surrounded on all sides by other slave-owning states. It became part of the Louisiana Purchase from France to America in 1803. It became an American state in 1812. And slavery already there from the colonial period, remained legalised until its suspension in 1864 under military law, and then legally as part of the 13th Amendment in 1865. In Louisiana, transport was frequently segregated and was always resisted since the mule-drawn carriages of the 1830s. In the 1860s, as civil war loomed, protest against segregation was organised by free people of colour in New Orleans, and they would successfully integrate the cars before the end of the Civil War. At the beginning of the 20th century, streetcars were boycotted again by black passengers in 1902 as a result of new streetcar legislation. So there is a history of protest within the streetcars in New Orleans from the days of slavery right through to the 20th century. Now, most people would recognise Rosa Parks' contribution to resisting bus segregation, but the bus boycotts were already taking place before the Montgomery bus boycott took place in Louisiana, years before she took her seat in the white section of the Alabama bus. This is the 1952 bus boycott in Baton Rouge. It didn't raise much of a profile outside the state, but it did make lots of the media at the time within the state. Lessons were learned because of the compromises made during this protest that would be later used by the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama, but also by legislators in 1958 when they were integrating the streetcars in New Orleans. Streetcars, here's two images of streetcars. This is the traditional streetcars. They tended to usually be green, and as you can see from this picture in the 1950s, they are still green, but they're electrified. They were electrified just at the end of the 19th century. On streetcars, segregation was protested, as we said, from the mule-drawn carriages, and sometimes it was mules, but mostly it was horses within the city, of the 1830s. They were integrated by African Americans in 1867, boycotted in 1902, and integrated for good in 1958. While segregation existed on the streetcars in Louisiana, it was protested passively and violently by streetcar passengers. And New Orleans is the location for this study. New Orleans was chosen from among the other major cities in Louisiana, such as Shreveport and Baton Rouge, for the focus of this study, primarily because it has the longest continuously running streetcar system in the world. New Orleans is also the most populous city in the state. It was also viewed as culturally diverse in that it had such a substantial population of free people of colour. Streetcars in other cities were entirely replaced by buses in the 20th century, which changed the dynamics of the space. If we look at streetcars alone, enforcement on the streetcars for segregation came from the conductors, who designated the race of passengers. In order to tell people that you have to sit in the black or the coloured section, you have to determine what race they are. So the conductor decides what race you are when you get on to the streetcar. New Orleans was very much a slave society in that, while it engaged in slavery of people of African descent, it also interwove slavery into every aspect of society. To be enslaved meant to be restricted and vulnerable. Restrictions, legal and social, also extended to people classed as free people of colour, also known as free blacks or gens de couleur libre, while also being the centre for the largest slave markets in the United States. The legislative history of streetcars in New Orleans and the social and racial history of the city are closely intertwined. The first successful run on the 5 miles of track took place in 1831. Streetcars were extremely popular with all classes of society, especially in the hotter seasons. And if anybody's been to New Orleans, and a few people have, mentioned just how intense the heat is in the city. They facilitated cheap and safe means of transport for ladies travelling alone, servants with children, and by servants I mean enslaved servants with children, and businessmen and women going to work, to and from work every day. Alternative forms of transport also existed, such as omnibuses, and these excluded black passengers altogether, while others allowed nurses, again enslaved nurses, with white children. Now there was also star cars. These were streetcars marked with a black star, but put in place to transport people of colour. These were infrequent, usually every third or fourth car, and unlike white streetcars, they were not segregated. Whites could also get on the star cars. The star car came to represent the person of colour in this society. It was vulnerable to white incursion, only partially and infrequently represented, and while it offered black passengers the same transport rights, such rights were marred with inconvenience. Running a business, offering services, and the general functions of existing in an urban environment were made all the more difficult for the black population by the presence of the star cars. Black commuters resisted segregation, sometimes passively passing for white on the non-star cars or violently confronting drivers throughout the slavery period. Something about the streetcars as well, again, as theatres within this society, is that if you had to use a streetcar or public transport at all, and you were going to go to work or run a business, as I said, you had to use this transport as this urban space became wider and wider, and because of the heat and the climate in the city. So if you were publicly put off a streetcar, or you were told that you could only use the star cars, or if you were subjugated as a black person in this society, it would happen every day, twice a day. So it has an impact on the psyche, and this is why you see this protest all along, because this is happening every day, twice a day. Now this is the population of New Orleans just before the Civil War, and this is what it looked like. It shows that while the majority of the population in each of the parishes of the state were black and enslaved, the majority of New Orleans was white and free. It also shows that alongside substantial urban slavery, free people of colour existed in substantial numbers in a concentrated environment. Urban slavery, because when we think about slavery, we usually think of plantations, we usually think of cotton or sugar. But urban slavery, it was no less traumatic than plantation slavery, with matching experiences of vulnerability, harsh punishments, and fractured families. However, urban slavery, particularly in New Orleans, did offer the opportunity for escape due to the presence of free people of colour who were already living in the city in significant numbers freely. Escapees were less likely to stand out as they would out in the plantation environment, and could easily disappear into the city. And the port of New Orleans offered a means of leaving the South. Difficult, but it did offer that means. Louisiana had the second highest number of runaway slaves among the southern slave states for this reason. People were enslaved into various occupations in the urban space and hired out to local plantations. Occupations listed in New Orleans included domestic service, trade, dock workers, but also tailors, coopers, locksmiths, barbers, and mechanics. Some jobs, such as dray drivers, which usually involved going down to the docks with a cart carrying cargo, required no supervision, and reports show their independence in these kind of roles. Laws existed against selling goods like alcohol to slaves, which suggests they had money, and newspaper reports point to slaves buying and selling stolen goods. Slaveholders could also allow slaves small independent earnings, and this was debated in planters' journals, indicating it was controversial. This image that you see here was a sketch taken from the Illustrated London News in 1861 of pre-auction viewing of house slaves. Now the term slave and servant were used interchangeably, and advertisements in New Orleans would show servants wanted signs alongside servants for sale signs. So what about owners freeing slaves in this society? Well, laws passed after 1825 show that manumission, the freeing of slaves, became increasingly difficult as the state becomes more Americanized. Owners had to pay for the transfer of newly freed slaves to Africa, and manumitted slaves had to leave the state within a year. Slaves could also not be freed before the age of 30, and owners also had to reach the age of 30 or else get a court order. More restrictions followed, which required any free slave to be a native of Louisiana, and owners were required to remain financially responsible for slaves they manumitted should they become destitute or ill, and this was clearly discouraging. While the law prohibited the sale of children under 10 years, and this was one quite unique for Louisiana, that you couldn't sell children under 10 years of age. You did see it advertised, you did see large groups of children, and their age groups would often be under 10 years of age, and they weren't sold as a family unit, they were sold by themselves. And the rarity of family groups sold together also indicates that slave families were highly vulnerable to dislocation through sale. Now also within this society, you have free people of colour. This is Julian Hudson, New Orleans artist, a member of the Gens de Couleur Libre community in New Orleans, and recognised as the first black portrait artist from the South. And below is one of his paintings of a free man of colour. So during the colonial period, French and Spanish men took black women as their mistresses and wives, openly living with them, recognising their children and furnishing them with land and financial assistance. Letters from leading white citizens to the governor cited complaints that ranged from black dominance of artisan trades, miscegenation, the intermarriage between blacks and whites, to opulent displays of wealth by blacks that threatened the distinction between the white and black races. At the end of the colonial period, free blacks were standing apart from their counterparts in positions and privileges. As their numbers grew, so did white resentment due to fears that white dominance would be blurred by the separate class of people who often appeared white, were of means and education, yet who were classed separately, and whose inheritance usually resulted from illegitimate birth. After the Louisiana purchase, free people of colour still enjoyed their ability to enjoy the same property rights as whites, and this is something that passed from French and Spanish laws into the American laws. A lot of the laws changed and became more rigid as the state became American, but this was one law that motivated black real estate investment, and for many free blacks, influence accompanied this wealth. So Louisiana's free black population was the largest in the Deep South, with social, economic and legal positions that far exceeded even substantial, comparable communities in other states. Although perhaps the opulence of the free black elite may have made them noteworthy, by 1860 only 10% are classed as manual workers. They dominated trades such as mechanics, carpenters, shoemakers, barbers and tailors. Prosperous free people of colour owned large sugar plantations and slaves, and lived in affluent houses in the city, usually on the same street as other successful people of colour. They built churches, socialised together and intermarried, strengthening their collective wealth and community. Creoles of colour were successful enough to motivate white politicians, who were generally fellow planters and businessmen, to push successfully for laws aimed at restricting free blacks after 1840. Laws were passed to arrest free blacks who weren't natives of Louisiana, and newspaper reports do show that these arrests were quite frequent. Appearing white, but being classed as black and therefore banned from public transport, caused resentment that often bubbled over and led to attacks on drivers who refused their custom. Slaves were allowed onto the streets cars as servants, escorting whites, and servant tickets were available for these purposes. No slaves were employed on the streetcars, but they were employed in the depots where manual labour was required. It was the proposed expansion of the star cars onto the new streetcar lines after 1860 that saw affluent free people of colour protest segregation and the star cars, a protest that would continue after the city was occupied by Union troops, and which saw free people of colour unite with the newly free men, the slaves that had been freed. The presence of black Union troops in the city, the suspension of slavery, and the threat of unrest led to the integration of the streetcars by military order in 1867. They would remain integrated until 1902. So here you see two photographs. The first is during Reconstruction, after the Civil War. You have the first African American lieutenant governor and acting governor for Louisiana, Oscar Dunn, and the second African American lieutenant governor and acting governor, P.B.S. Pitchback. Reconstruction in the South lasted from 1867 until 1877, but radical policies such as voting rights and integration of public amenities lasted longer in Louisiana than in any other of the post-Confederate states in the South. Unlike the other 10 states, Louisiana was de jure integrated state until 1890, though random segregation did take place on ferries and on trains, and this was the reality. In fact, Jim Crow laws on transport, miscegenation, and education passed earlier in every other state apart from Louisiana. With transport now fully integrated, accounts from the period suggest that black passengers preferred to sit with other black passengers when they used the streetcars. But more refined, well-dressed black customers sat with their white equivalents forward of the car. And in just this behaviour lay the problem for whites who were, while willing to concede political and civil rights to coloured citizens, were unwilling to recognise social equality. Complaints from whites began as early as 1867, with the New Orleans Times complaining of coloured people who know their rights sleeping on streetcars and being obnoxious to whites. Transport integration in general throughout Louisiana and the South depended on the conductor, other passengers, and rail and steamship policy. The Plessy v. Ferguson case, which originated in New Orleans in 1890, saw trains in New Orleans segregated, but not streetcars. Homer Plessy was a light-skinned African American who tested segregation of trains after the Separate Car Act in Louisiana in 1890. Segregation and the separate but equal premise was upheld by the United States Supreme Court in 1896, allowing segregation everywhere in society, and not just in Louisiana, everywhere in all of the states. This, however, initially did not include streetcars. Generally, the reason was this. Unlike trains, streetcars had standardized fares, which prevented restrictions based on class or wealth, and they were used by all classes of society. The free seating policy reduced racial friction through to the beginning of the 20th century, However, the same was not true of railway carriages, which socially elevated affluent blacks in first-class carriages that financially and socially excluded poorer whites to 1890. The language of reform in this period was becoming more direct, and any reference to the rights of blacks was absent. Louisiana was the first state to pass a mandatory statute affecting every city in 1902. In the same way that trains became segregated as they technologically and luxuriously improved, like what you see here, so too did the streetcars. When they became electrified in 1893 and we lost the horses, calls for the segregation of the streetcars began almost immediately. And this is what they looked like around about 1910. Segregation took the form of a screen rather than a separate car, so there wasn't a return to the star cars. And it meant that companies did not have the added expense, and that's really what it came down to, of extra cars. And they could avoid totally alienating black customers. Because when it came down to business, segregation was favoured as long as it didn't impact the streetcar finances. Boycotts were organised in the city shortly after the passing of the 1902 Separate Streetcar Act. This peaceful but active protest lacked the radical action of the 1860s. Black travellers were not in the same strong position that they had been after the Civil War, and the rise of white supremacy after 1890 made them much more vulnerable. However, the streetcars companies were slow to segregate and faced threats of prosecution if they did not comply. And really this came down to they didn't want to have to train the conductors to decide who was what race. Also, they didn't want the inconvenience of having to move screens or having people confront them. Eventually, screens were erected and resistance by customers occurred almost immediately. Pressures on conductors to collect fares from, quote, disgruntled blacks jammed in the rear of the car at times spilled over into violence. The movable screen that you can see here, there was all types of ideas that came up for what this screen was going to look like. It ranged from a cage to a full screen, and this is what they eventually ended up with. It's a piece of wood that slides in the top of the seat. The movable screens, which reduced the seating in each car, caused friction with the conductor because white passengers had to stand when they could see that there was seats available in the car. One of the first arrests was a white man named Wise, who paid the fine of $25 for refusing to vacate the last available seat on the streetcar, which was in the coloured section. Complaints were that only obviously black people were partitioned, while, quote, white Negroes, known to be so, are allowed to seat themselves among the whites. The opportunities that the World War I in 1914-1916 produced for bolstering this southern economy also presented labour shortages in the south and prompted whites to increase black subordination in an effort to maintain the workforce and prevent wages from rising. This was compounded by rural migration to New Orleans. On streetcars within the city, reports of increased violent interactions became more frequent as the black population swelled and led to increased black streetcar usage. In turn, the competition for space between black and white passengers exacerbated racial friction. Heightened vigilance towards segregation policies on streetcars during the war period reflected an approach towards the black population that white supremacist propaganda and support for the increasingly popular Ku Klux Klan encouraged. As race riots erupted in cities around America in 1919, the Red Summer reiterated this white supremacist position across the United States. It was sparked by housing and employment post-war tensions following the demobilization of veterans. White mobs attacked and killed hundreds of African Americans. Now, it was called a riot, but usually during this period, when it is called a riot, it usually means white on black violence, not the other way around. Now, lynch law, the lynching of members of the black population, occurred generally in rural areas in Louisiana, but it gradually reached the city and was an ever-looming threat to black passengers who stepped over the colour line. Now, although you don't have much incidence of lynching within the city, the New Orleans newspapers carry very detailed account of lynchings that take place around the state. So it's always there, and it's always as a warning for stepped out of place. Throughout the nation, one-drop rule cases use evidence based primarily on rumour and association to establish the race of plaintiffs. So when people complained because they were put off trains, they would go to court and they had to establish their whiteness, and this was called one-drop rule cases. One drop of black or African blood makes you black. It doesn't matter how white you are regardless. Out of such cases grew a fear by whites, who might otherwise have tolerated loose terms of segregation, of race definition by association, and this works very well for segregation. The effect of the one-drop rule was twofold. It served to unite whites as a collective, identifying them as an exclusive group, and stop them from mixing or wanting to mix with African Americans on the streetcars. So, they supported segregation. Where you have rigid segregation, you also have violence, particularly between the conductor and the black passengers. Reports of conductors violently assaulting black passengers and of black passengers violently assaulting conductors were quite common. However, as the society began to force the acceptance of segregation, they also stopped reporting on infringements of the Jim Crow law. Because they wanted it to be seen as acceptable, they started calling these people who stepped across the colour line, they started calling it assault or affray. And they stopped reporting Jim Crow, which distanced it from the root cause. After 1920, New Orleans was promoted as a tourist destination, boosting construction and growth of cities, new hotels, increasing park facilities, and an airport, all of which were segregated. After 1920, New Orleans was one of only two of the southern cities to resist the encroachment of the Klan because of a largely immigrant Catholic population, and the Klan, and the Klan was more successful in the traditional Anglo-northern part of the state. The state governor also opposed the Klan because it had killed non-compliant whites within the state. It had also killed many non-compliant blacks before that, but until whites were killed, then they lost support. After 1920, the conductors are instructed to call the police rather than eject black passengers, though they continue to do so. In the early 20s, blacks and white passengers continued to complain of overcrowding and the continual challenge to segregation that resulted. By the latter half of the 1920s, such complaints were becoming more frequent, most likely as a result of buses being introduced in the city and the rise of automobile use. Conductors who complied with policy had commuters arrested for infringement of segregation, while violence was usually the outcome when a conductor confronted a passenger. And the friction did not stop with the advent of buses and cars, which suggests that black passengers continued to resist the subservient role demanded by Jim Crow segregation. It is also indicative that conductors no longer saw observation of segregation alone as compliance and reacted to patrons who did not show deference or comply with Jim Crow etiquette. So at the end of the 20s, what you see is it's not just that you are obeying the law, but also that you have now a Jim Crow etiquette where you do not question a white man's integrity, his ability to count change. You do not inconvenience him in any way by not having the correct change when you get on, because this can result in affray, violence, and arrest. In addition to the wider use of buses and automobiles, the decline of the street railways was compounded by a violent streetcar strike in 1929, and 5 lines were terminated to be replaced by buses and trackless trolleys. The Great Depression also had a significant impact on city transport systems throughout North America. Unemployment reduced ridership, which in turn hastened the abandonment and conversion to much more adaptable transport such as buses. Nationally, ridership on all transport fell sharply by 1930, and 2 streetcar lines ended in 1931, with 5 more quickly being retired. However, even though they only made up 58.3% of vehicle miles, they were responsible for 73.7% of the revenue at this time. So overcrowding was a continual theme. World War II, things change again. Throughout World War II, there was a huge increase in the population in New Orleans, which artificially peaked in 1945 on streetcars, buses, and trackless trolleys. The urban population in these years expanded as defence industry workers and servicemen and women and the static population crowded onto the streetcars. Once rationing and war production diminished privately owned cars and taxi uses. So it's rationed now, so you have to use the streetcars. The introduction of women conductors that you can see here in this image did not lessen racial conflict on the cars. Some conductorettes claimed their race signs were benign and never caused anybody any harm. Clear instructions were given during the war years to all staff on the crowded streetcars to treat passengers in a courteous, friendly way in order to avoid conflict. In contrast, they were also advised to embarrass customers who refused to move to their designated racial spheres, which suggests that this was a continual problem. Military police and regular police provided support for male and female workers, and really you do see the police stepping up more as soon as you have female workers on the streetcars. White soldiers who did not comply with segregation were also arrested, and Jim Crow had a significantly negative impact on ordinary whites. White conformity on streetcars was necessary, and this usually meant a suppression of white disdainers, including the white soldiers who ironically were fighting for freedom abroad. Integration, both during and after the war years, gradually starts to take place outside of the South. The FBI singled out transport as an important platform for both blacks and whites to act out their resentment of Jim Crow laws. A survey of racial conditions in the United States found that segregation greatly reduced the amount of transport availability to black passengers. This scarcity, alongside the assertive change in attitude among blacks, was responsible for minor clashes and fights between blacks and whites throughout the South. Violence on the streetcars was common during the war. Crowding on the cars meant that blacks and whites encountered each other much more frequently and physically than they had outside of the war years. Streetcars were described as theatres for racial conflict during the overcrowded period. Resisting blacks had a captive audience of both black and white passengers who were forced to witness defiance and frustration with Jim Crow. Now, in 1939, President Roosevelt created a civil rights section in the Justice Department to combat lynching. Although it had little success with prosecutions, by 1942, Roosevelt had specifically ordered an investigation of all black deaths that were linked to lynching. It is arguable that the existence of the existence of civil rights section within the Justice Department prevented a repeat of the summer of 1919 because lynching communities were now guaranteed to be investigated. Throughout the 1940s, lynching investigations increased, which gave a recognition of injustice to black deaths that had been absent in the past. Racial reform was increasing in the South, where black voter registration increased foretold in the 1940s. And states like Maryland, on the periphery of the South, Catholic schools and swimming pools were beginning to desegregate. In St. Louis and Washington, D.C., some theatres and lunch counters integrated, and medical societies began admitting black doctors. But this wouldn't happen in Louisiana until the 1960s. Streetcars do go into decline in the 1950s. More and more cars are retired, and the Canal and St. Charles line were the last two routes left. However, there was 85 cars on these routes, so it's quite a substantial amount still. This was attributed to the rise in motor car usage and the stay-at-home allure of television. Sources from that period describe streetcars being used as entertainment for children by busy parents, or to get to the movies or to the park. By 1950, there was 40,000 television sets in New Orleans, a number which continued to boom as the 1950s progressed. Television seduced generations to stay at home by reducing the need for outside entertainment. Instead of going to the park, kids now watched cowboy and Indians on television. Transport legislation was revised in 1956 in Louisiana during the year-long Montgomery bus boycott. Though the bus boycott had successfully achieved a measure of integration on buses in Baton Rouge in 1953, as I said, it was localized and it had a limited impact. The Montgomery bus boycott, however, showed what could be achieved on a much larger scale in an age of television, where manufacturers turned out over 6 million TVs a year, and Martin Luther King was making headlines. Transport as the public theatre and long-time source of contention in Louisiana rose high on the agenda of civil rights organisations within the state in the 1950s. Now, the Brown case was Brown versus the Board of Education, which integrated education and overturned the separate but equal mandate, which means segregation was no longer justifiable. However, unlike segregated schools, where a dual system had long required investment by the state and rationalisation to justify taxpayers' money, buses and streetcars required only vigilance by willing drivers, conductors, or members of the public to enforce segregation. And in general, they were very willing. In 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education decision may have signposted the road to change for the black community, but to whites it marked the beginning of a struggle to maintain segregation. This would change in 1954 as Louisiana, like many other southern states like Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina, created a joint legislative committee on segregation. However, the mayor of New Orleans, Mayor Morrison, and to some extent the governor of Louisiana, existed outside the political and conservative racism of the Citizens Council, in that they saw integration coming and did not want the violence coming to New Orleans after the Montgomery bus boycott integrated transport and was held by the Supreme Court in 1956. And here you can see Abraham Lincoln Davis, the men responsible for integrating the streetcars, and this is Mayor Chet Morrison. An umbrella under which local movements could organise, the Southern Leadership Conference attracted Abraham Lincoln Davis, a New Orleans minister reputed to be Mayor Morrison's most influential supporter in the black community. In June 1956, David and other influential black leaders founded the New Orleans Improvement League. As an influential supporter, he was in a key position to make demands that would have less impact from an outsider. In January 1957, Mayor Sleepy Morrison was faced with the dilemma of losing white support by integrating the city transport system, or by segregating, facing a lawsuit and losing the support of the black community. Since 1952, Morrison's dilemma was not unique, as Governor Long had experienced the same push and pull against the Citizens' Council. Morrison's strategy for maintaining votes from both blacks and whites reflected Long's. In January 1957, he publicly promoted the segregation of the streetcars, while promising peaceful integration once a federal court order compelled him to do so. And he was as good as his word. Without publicity, he had all the signs and segregation paraphernalia removed from the streetcars on the 31st of May 1958. Morrison's integration of the streetcars was very low-key. Streetcar management organised the burning of all the signs in order that the drivers and conductors could not resist streetcar integration, as they had in the Baton Rouge boycott years earlier. Eyewitnesses reported they did not want any of the segregation signs to be in existence the next morning. They wanted them all gone. Removing the segregation signs at night and announcing integration in the cars quietly in the newspapers ensured that segregation, however, continued de facto. The Louisiana press was very quiet on the integration of the streetcars, and there were relatively few cases of racial mixing, and the reports indicated a pattern whereas adult black men and middle-aged older white black women continued to go deliberately to the back. Racial mixing came from younger white and black women. Black women in particular, young black women, started sitting forward of the streetcars. And this is a streetcar from 1955. And this had been happening since 1902. So you can imagine how difficult it was to, after having this institutionalized for so long, to then move to the front of the bus. So it's a very brave thing to do, even though the cars are legally integrated, because you still don't know what's going to happen. There's that fear. And the conductors are still white. So just to finish, streetcars have been integrated since 1958, but the company continued to employ only white motormen and conductors on streetcars and buses. As a result, blacks remained in the same deferential position to the white authority of the motormen that bus drivers that they always had. Then in 1961, the New Orleans Consumer League, organized by Abraham Lincoln Davis again, threatened to boycott the buses and streetcars in conjunction with the gas and electricity service if management did not hire black streetcar and bus drivers. The company capitulated, and in 1961, black employees were promoted to drivers. As a result, 1961 was the year that de jure and de facto, legally and in fact, integration finally materialized on the New Orleans streetcars and buses. The streetcars once again stood apart as segregation ordinances in other spheres, such as public accommodations, would continue to remain segregated until 1969. Just going to leave you with some findings here. Let's read through that, and if you would like to ask me any questions.
Thank you very much.